Taking to the trapeze this week to discuss how to keep the Fed from political influence are Democratic Congressman Juan Vargas of California and former Republican chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Patrick McHenry. Thank you both for being here, gentlemen. And Juan, I'll get right into it with you. Why is it important for the Federal Reserve to be independent?
Well, I think it's important for the Federal Reserve to be independent because we want a central bank in a modern economy like ours, a modern industrialized economy, to have people making decisions long-term for the economy, for the issue of stable prices, and also for the issue of employment. You don't want people making quick political decisions, politicians like myself. Instead, you want people that are there for a long period of time, that are secure in their position and saying, okay, what is good for this economy long-term, not what is good for the politicians in a way that helps them for the next election, and because that could be disastrous for your economy. And that's why I think it's very important to have something like the Fed in a country like ours, where they're somewhat independent of politics and making decisions, monetary decisions, that keep the economy going in a way that's efficient and a way that allows them to grow without undue influence by politicians.
Patrick, is the Fed independent in your mind?
The Fed is independent. And look, as Juan outlined, and he and I agree that the Fed should be independent. But as Juan outlined, you have a process under the law that created the Federal Reserve by which the president has appointees and the Senate confirms those appointees. So that is a political check on the Federal Reserve. The structure of the Federal Reserve is to be representative. So we have regional banks that are supposed to bring the facts on the ground from that region to monetary policy decisions by the Federal Reserve, number one. Number two, there are long terms. The longest terms in our government are Fed governors. And so the idea here is to appoint somebody, free them from the day-to-day politics that the rest of the government lives under, and say your mandate is to have a view of stable prices for the long term. I think that is necessary and good for us to have a prosperous country where we have proper allocation of capital and get the greatest outcome for our people. Now, every president has an opinion about Federal Reserve decisions. Lyndon Johnson at one point had a physical confrontation with one of his Fed chairs. You go back to FDR during the Great Depression. He determined the price of gold, which then determined the decisions the Federal Reserve was required to make under the act at that time. So from time to time, presidents have had a big say in the decisions and have been vocal about it. So what President Trump is doing is in that longer term view, what most presidents have at least privately thought, and in some cases have publicly stated.
Juan, has Trump gone too far as attacking the independence of the Federal Reserve?
Oh, he's gone way too far. Of course he has. I mean, it is fascinating to me because obviously he's going after the chairman and one member, but the chairman is the person he picked. It's his chairman. You know, everybody thinks he's the palace, a Democrat. No, Trump picked him, and I think he's done a pretty solid job. We have to remember we went through a pandemic, something that's historic in nature. And I think he did a pretty good job. Now, some people say he was too slow to move. It could be. But at the same time, you remember, we didn't go into a depression. We could have very easily slipped into something terrible if there wasn't prudence at the Fed. So what has happened now is the president doesn't like the politics of it. He's got to cut much more quickly. So he's saying all these things. And frankly, many of them which are not true or unsubstantiated. And this kind of pressure is not good. The chairman McHenry made a good example, gave a couple good examples, but he didn't give the most recent one, which of course was Nixon in the 70s. Nixon in the 70s too pressured the Fed and the chair, and they made a decision, I think, based on politics, and it created stagflation. It was horrible for the economy, and I think that's why we should keep the president the heck out of politics here.
Well, isn't President Trump just trying to hold the Fed's feet to the fire and just keep them accountable by criticizing them and attacking them?
I think that's fine to criticize, but the attack, the issue of saying, okay, this governor right here we're going to remove her for cause when it's completely unsubstantiated, or attacking the Fed chair and saying there's cost overruns in this building, therefore that's cause and he ought to be fired. That's baloney. And what that does is it causes a lot of uncertainty in our economy and certainly internationally, because they don't know what the heck's going on. That's what he should stay out of. He can say, hey, I think the rates are too high. I think this guy acts too slowly. He misses the signs. Okay, that's fine. But trying to put his own people in there, kind of stuff in the court, as you will, with the Supreme Court, that's wrong. That's not a good thing to do.
So, Patrick, it seems that there's this reverence for the independence of the Fed for the reasons you both articulated, but there's also a concern about accountability from things like, properly and analyzing data in a proper manner, in a quick manner, and other things. And, there is some question about reform. So I'd like to hear, would you suggest any reforms to the Fed? And as part of those reforms, would you ever think about removing presidential appointments to take away some of that sting of the president's influence?
No, the checks and balances in our constitutional republic require the presidential appointment and Senate confirmation of really important folks in our government, and I think the Fed it should be included in that nature. I would say that from time to time we address the statute that the Federal Reserve acts under. This has been done multiple times, actually dozens of times over the last 100 years. So it is not outside the bounds to address the statute and make sure it is a more resilient, more representative, more accountable agency or central bank. And so I think it is important for Congress to look at this. We've given the Fed regulatory powers that they have misused or failed to use appropriately. We've checked that. We've changed that. And we've repeatedly changed that over the last 30 years in particular. So for us to address the statute is good. And that is a proper thing the government should undertake. I think you can change the Open Markets Committee and make it more representative of where the economy is. I think you can make sure that the data they use and the systems to collect that data are the best they can possibly be, which means you need to make sure they're well funded and good appointees running those agencies. I think there's some really important things to make sure we deliver here, even amidst this highly divisive politics around the Federal Reserve.
So we got about a minute left, so I'll ask each the same question. I'll start with Patrick. Should the president have the ability to remove members of the Fed? Patrick? Yes,
and he does under the statute, and the courts are testing this for the first time on whether or not this was an appropriate firing that President Trump made of Governor Lisa Cook. We will find out, and the Supreme Court will opine on that.
Juan?
Well, I think the president should be able to fire people, but for cause, not for baloney. And I think that's what he's attempting to do right now. And I think that the courts have already said it. And I think the Supreme Court will get the last say. But it really has to be for cause, not for this stuff that's made up because he wants a lower interest rate.
Gentlemen, I appreciate you both so much for your input. Thank you very much.